Some of you enjoyed the story of St Chad and the account of Lastingham and the difficulties he had with Wilfrid. So, in case you're interested, and feel free to listen, watch if you want, and not if you don't want. I'm going to read you some more of David Adams' book on Eagle's Wings, The Life and Spirit of Chad. And I'm going to start at the beginning because that's a good place to start. And if we get that far, I will tell you where the Lastingham bit is, and then you can go to that video if you've missed it so far. So the first chapter is called The Journey to Lindisfarne. Make yourself comfortable because there's going to be a good half hour of this, I should think. Travelling over the sands was very exciting for the four brothers, for they seemed to be going out to sea. Their horses were splashing in the watery sands beneath them. This was a marvellous play for anyone wanting to ride at speed. It took them all their self-restraint not to race against each other. Never had the brothers faced such a wide expanse. They were more used to openings in the forests. This was like entering a new world. To the left of them were sand dunes covered in grasses, but no signs of life apart from birds. It all seemed very wild and lacking in trees. Away far to the right, over endless sands, towered the fortress of Bamborough, where Oswald was the king. The brothers could see silver smoke rising from the area. It was Oswald who was responsible for them being here today, if not directly, then indirectly, for he had invited the monk Aidan to come from Iona to teach the Angles. Oswald believed that Christianity would be the uniting factor between the ancient people of the land and his own incoming Angles. The father of the four boys rode out in front, determined to be the leader and guiding them to the small rising land on the horizon. It was not possible to ride to the south because of the river that curled over the sands as it went out to sea. Ciarán had been warned that this was not a safe place. There are quicksands, and sometimes the tide rushes in and catches the unwary. Many lives had been lost in crossing to and from Lindisfarne. He had been assured that it was safe to cross the tidal stretch this afternoon as long as he was off again before the tide was 2 hours to its peak. Later than that, and his horse would be swimming. Because it was a time of a half moon, the tides were not so deep, and that is why the monks had invited him to come over the sands on this day. Ciarán trusted these men he was visiting for their sending him the message about the tide. A greater trust, however, was being asked of him, in that he had been asked to leave his 4 sons with the monks of Lindisfarne. How Ciarán heard of Aidan and his monks we do not know. It is possible that he was a person of some importance and had contact with King Oswald. Perhaps Oswald had suggested that his boys would be ideal for the school on the island. The older ones Ciarán could well imagine being trained and sent out. But what of Chad, his youngest? The lad was but a child, even though he was growing up quickly. Today he could see Chad enjoying the adventure, but when left with these strange monks away from home, he might quickly change his tune. With the 5 horsemen were a few men from Ciarán's estate, bringing gifts and food for the monks and some planking for houses. Ciarán let the cart set the pace for their travelling. It was important that they all kept together. He had been told that the education of the boys would be free. There was no charge, though in turn each of the boys would be expected to provide for the others. If they did not have any funds, they would do it through labour or through begging for food. Ciarán certainly did not like the idea of his boys begging like the countless poor who were around. He must see if he could provide for them in some way. He would pay the fosterage tithe that was normal for any child sent to live with another family. That is, if these monks actually dealt with money. If not, they might like grain, honey and wood until they had set their own farms up and running. As they rode on, the curlew cried overhead a sad song, a song of the moors as well as the sea. Their crying made Chad think of home and their farm. He would miss his mother and the rest of the family. He would miss the friends of his own age with whom he had mock battles. He had thought of becoming a warrior when he grew up and fighting for the king. Now he was going to be a soldier of the great king, or so his father had told him. Already Chad had heard that these holy men were called soldiers of Christ. He had heard that they fought battles against demons and powers of darkness. They even challenged the devil himself. Thinking of these terrors, Chad began to wonder whether he ought to return home with his father. But that would be to act like a baby and a coward. He was growing to be a strong young man, and he must show that he was not afraid. Anyhow, if Ked, Caolan, and Kynabil could become warriors for Christ, so could he. This little group poses us a few unanswered questions. Where did they come from? Where did their Christian faith come from if the monks of Lindisfarne were the first to bring Christianity to Northumbria? Bede tells us the boys were Northumbrians, so we know they belong to the area somewhere between the Forth and the Humber. It is likely that they were from not too far from Lindisfarne or Bamborough. Were they Angles or were they British? Or to ask it another way, were they English or Celtic? This we shall never know. Could it be that they were both, and so ideally suited for the Lindisfarne mission? The year was 635, so it was almost 100 years since Ida the Flame-Bearer had invaded the land of the British and built his stockade at Bamborough. The last great battle of the British was here on the edge of the sands they were crossing. In this very area, Urien ap Reged, the Christian king, died trying to drive the pagan Angles into the sea. Even that was now history, for it was over 50 years ago. The battle that Urien lost reminds us that this area between the Forth and the Humber was a Christian country. It may be that Christianity was not a majority religion, but it was well established, at least in some areas. At the Roman wall area there has recently been found a Christian church from the 5th century. It is also thought that St. Patrick came from the western end of the wall. Patrick's father was a deacon and his grandfather a priest, so Christianity was not new to the region. But until now the British had not attempted to convert the English, which is not surprising when the English came as the conquerors. By the 7th century there was a growing together of the peoples. There was intermarriage between the Angles, who were now settled, and the local indigenous British. More often now it was not the conquering of a people that was bringing together the different factions, but the joining of families in marriage. It could just be that these lads were of such a mixed marriage. If that were the case, they would be ideally suited for the task ahead of uniting the two groups into one nation. It would also mean that they were already bilingual and could speak a Celtic language as well as that of the Angles. If you look at the names of this family, they do look like an anglicised form of Celtic names. The four boys were called Ked, Kynabil, Caolan, and Ceadda. The last of these names is usually shortened to Chad. Because we are always given the names in this order, we assume that Ked was the oldest and Chad the youngest. It is likely that all of the boys were teenagers and that this was a great adventure for them, though Celtic monasteries did take in children for training as young as 7. Glancing back to see that his boys were all following, Caolan could see the Cheviot mountain rearing its massive head over the nearby hills. In the mellowness of the day, it looked as if it were blue and not white-topped, as its name means in the Celtic language. They were now coming to the island proper. The wet sand was giving way to sandy fields and scrub. To the south they could see the smoke rising from a fire, but they could see no sign of houses. Looking around, it seemed promising land. It should be good for growing crops if they could stand the salt spray from the sea. There were clumps of hazel and willow, but most of the bushes leaned at an angle, which showed there was a predominance of very strong westerly winds. Caolin could see to the southeast in the distance an outcrop of rock. Perhaps the village would be there, for it could have a fortress on the top. However, the smoke was coming from the south end of the island, so they followed the smoke. Now, after a quarter of a mile, Caolin could see huts in a small enclosure. They were obviously new, and some were not yet finished. He wondered to what sort of place the people had brought the lads. Could anything come of this little settlement? There was nothing that looked noble or comfortable, nor did it look as if it could be easily defended. These men were having to build a village for themselves before they could do anything else. The farming of the land had not yet started. The most striking object within the enclosure was a large wooden standing cross, which was about the height of 2 men. The group of riders had been seen, and now someone was coming to meet them. As he came, he wiped his hands on the rough apron he was wearing as a protection for his other clothes. This was not a big man, but he was obviously a confident man. He greeted them, but Caolin was not sure of the words. Aidan, though soft-spoken, was a man of great might. As Aidan did not know much of the Anglian language, it was necessary to keep the words few and simple. Even Aidan's Celtic tongue was not quite like the language of the British in Northumbria. Caolin would learn that was because Aidan was originally from Ireland. But though his tongue was different from the Celtic-speaking British, there were enough words in common for the 2 men to communicate. Again, Caolin glanced at the houses. His lads had been used to good housing. He really wondered where they would be put up and if there was room for the 4 of them. There were not as many as a dozen huts on the whole site, though a few more were nearly completed. Aidan was obviously excited by the presence of the young men. These were to be among his first students. They were to be among the next generation of priests and maybe more, but that is dreaming and jumping too far ahead. Aidan felt that he was luckier than the priest Eli in the Bible, for here he was given 4 young men. He prayed to God that they might hear his voice and serve him faithfully with Aidan in this land. At first, though their father had dismounted, the boys remained on their horses, and Aidan had to look up to them to greet them. He called others across, and they came welcoming and smiling at the boys. All of them had to look up to these young men on horseback. Aidan would remind Chad in particular of this in the years to come. Caolin saw the awkwardness of the situation and ordered his boys to dismount to be on the same level as the men who were attempting to speak to them. The lads were slow at getting down and were a little afraid of coming to greet the monks. "These are my sons, Cedd Cainable Caolin and Ceadda." Chad was amazed at the firmness of the grasp of these monks. They did look like warriors, even though there was no sign of any weapons. It was their strange hairstyle that gave them the appearance of Celtic warriors. Each of them had shaved their hair from the front of their heads, so that there was no hair in front of the ears. The whole forehead and half the top was bald. Chad found this quite fascinating and could hardly stop staring. The strangeness was accentuated by the fact that their hair grew long down the back. Chad suddenly wondered if his hair would be shaved like this, and he began to fear. He looked at Aidan, caught a twinkle in his eye, and forgot his worry. Aidan looked a kindly, yet a tough man. "Dominus vobiscum, welcome in the name of the Lord. Caolin, we greet you and your family in the name of Christ our Saviour. They certainly all look like strong lads. You do not know how important they are to me. The unity of this country, the bonding together of various peoples, will depend on such as these. Through our mission here, the English and the British could become one people serving one God. If they do their work properly, they will join together that which was once at war and bring a deeper peace to our land. More than that, they are called to be the soldiers of the great King and will be asked to give their lives in his service." Caolan was not sure of all that Aidan said, but he thought this was maybe not a bad place after all for the fosterage of his sons. Here, away from the mainland, they would be less likely to be raided. They would learn more than farming. They would learn to read and calculate. They would be able to speak from shapes on pieces of vellum and tell others what was written there. Here they would certainly learn discipline and how to become leaders of men. Caolan suddenly became anxious. If he stayed too long, perhaps Chad at least would want to come back home with him. He made the tide his excuse and said he needed to be away. Aidan, knowing there was plenty of time for the tide had hardly turned, tried to dissuade him and offered him a meal. Caolan pointed to Chad in a way that only Aidan noticed and shook his head. Aidan then understood and nodded to Caolan. It was now time to present the monks with gifts of vegetables, grain, honey, candles, and wax, with the planking of the cart on which the planking was carried. Aidan thanked Caolan and then said, "We will not need all these horses. We have not enough land to keep them on, and we do not intend to be going far for a while. The few horses that we have on the island will do." Caolan shuddered at this. He thought at least one of his boys would object. They were very attached to their horses. Usually it was hard to get them to be separated from them. Horses were a symbol of authority and of wealth, of power and manhood. But the firmness in Aidan's voice convinced him to see to the removal of the horses. Immediately he got 4 of his workmen to take the reins from each boy, and then he bid them all farewell. Chad nearly refused to let go, until he caught a glance both of his father and of Aidan. There were tears in his eyes, as all that was familiar to him seemed to move away, but at least he had his brothers, and he was sure Ken would look after him. "Come and see what we have done," said Aidan as he led the boys over the vallum and towards the huts. "We have prepared this land with 40 days of fasting and prayer. We set it aside to the glory of God. We cleansed it from evil, fighting against all demons, and so reclaimed it for God and his goodness. This wall may not keep out an army, but it keeps the powers of evil at bay." The boys were not sure that they understood all that Aidan was saying. His accent was very different from the dialect of the British that they knew. They looked at each other and secretly pulled faces to express puzzlement. Aidan continued. "Here inside this circle will be your home. I will introduce you to the brothers you live with." Chad began to be afraid, for he suddenly realized that he was to be separated from his brothers. Each was being sent to a different hut. "Come and meet your cellmate, for he will be responsible for teaching you many things. In turn, you will help him to understand the language of the English." None of the brethren were very elderly. In fact, all were strong young men. Chad looked upon his new lodgings with some disgust. The room was almost without furnishing, not much better than what was provided for the cattle at home. The sleeping area was little more than a pile of straw and a covering of some sort, yet its single occupant was friendly enough. Though the window was not glazed, it had a shutter to keep out the wind. From the window it was possible to look back to the mainland and the high hills. "Chad, I am to be your Anapkara, your cellmate, or as we say, your soul friend. I have the responsibility for teaching you the faith, and you will teach me to speak as the Angles do. We will begin tomorrow. Today, let me show you around the island." As they left the hut, Chad could see Ked already stepping out with his own soul friend. It was a pity he did not know what the words meant. To be called a cellmate made him sound like a prisoner. Perhaps that was what he now was. In a strange way, he had been taken captive by these men and held on this little island. Maybe he would never escape from this new kind of captivity. The sun was shining, and the island was beautiful. Chad began to think it might not be so bad after all. They climbed the highest rock and looked all around them. Below to the west was another small island, and beyond that the mainland. To the east was the wide sea dotted with a few more little islands. Down to the south was the capital, Bamborough, where the king lived. Chad hoped they would be able to go there quite often. Northwards, in the far distance, were great cliffs and inland high hills. Looking right around, Chad realised that his eyes could only take in a little at a time. This was a wide panorama indeed. "We have called this the Hugh," said his companion. "And look, there are a couple of seals swimming in the sea below us." Chad was delighted to see these great creatures and hardly noticed as his companion continued. "Below the Hugh on the landward side are our houses. The hill protects them from some of the winds. Beyond the monastery we intend to grow our corn." They walked further down the Hugh and met the rest of Chad's brothers. "Here in the harbour we have a couple of boats beached. One is used for fishing and the other in our journeying to Bamborough and beyond." "Have you ever been out fishing?" Chad had to admit he had only fished in the river, never in the sea, but he would like to learn. "I will teach you how to make nets and we will fish together. Listen, the bell is being struck. In a few moments it will be time for prayer. Come, let us go to the church." Chad had noticed the large oak building with the high wooden cross outside. Now his three brothers and the monks who were with them clambered down from the hillside. When they got to the church, each was shown where to stand. Everyone faced the altar. Candles were lit and the lovely smell of honey mingled with the rich smell of wood. The oak planking of which the church was made had only recently been cut and adzed. The church had a mixture of smells, and Chad concentrated on these: wood and soil, candles and people, and there was just the faint smell of the sea. The brother next to him smelt of sheep, and this made Chad feel more at home. In the silence, Chad could hear his own breathing as regular as the sound of the sea. For what appeared to be a long time, everyone stood in silence. Not a single word was spoken. Ken gave a little wave across to Chad, hoping he would not be noticed by the monks. Chad waved back, and Aidan smiled at them both. When the service did begin, each of the boys could only listen. It was not in English or in a British tongue, it was in Latin. Fortunately, they were at least used to a Latin mass, so words here and there and an occasional sentence were familiar. They could reply to Dominus Vobiscum. They knew the Lord's Prayer and the Gloria, and they knew the Kyries. The words ebbed and flowed like the sea. It sounded like poetry they were reciting, the sound of their voices echoing the sound of wind and waves outside. It was all very soothing, and Chad began to feel quite sleepy. That is, until he felt hungry, and he began to wonder when they would eat. Suddenly the service ended. Again there was a long silence before anyone moved. Then they all seemed to get up and go out at once. It was time to eat. The refectory was much like the church, a single room made of oak planking. The tables and benches were of the same planking, though the adzing made them very smooth. There was a smell of newly cut wood, but no smell of food. Chad fancied a nicely cooked bird. He got this, but in its earliest stage. He was given an egg, a few green vegetables, and a chunk of bread. "Eat up and enjoy it," whispered his soul friend, "for there will be no food tomorrow until 3 in the afternoon. Though if you feel weakly tomorrow, you can have some water. We will also keep silent from now on. There will be no speaking unless it is necessary or to do with worship or work." Chad no longer felt like eating, yet he ate it all, wondering how he would survive tomorrow until 3 in the afternoon. The idea of not talking also worried him. How would he spend his time without talking to the person he was with? He would willingly have left for home, but the tide was now in, and his horse had been taken away. Silence was to become part of the rhythm of Chad's life, and it began with this meal, though in fact, while everyone ate, one person was reading from a lectern. Chad did not understand a word, but it filled the silence. There were times over the next weeks when if it were not for the sea or the wind, he might have thought he had gone deaf. He was slowly to discover that silence is a great teacher. In time it became a pleasure to feel the silence after the calling of the bell or after the blessing at the end of a service. Silence became a time of not wanting to possess or to impress. It was a time to be possessed, to rest in God who was to be found in each of us and all about us. But this is racing ahead. At this moment the silence seemed to envelop Chad, and its power was a little frightening. He was soon in the cell with his new companion. The shutter had been closed on the window, as had the door. Between their beds a little light flickered in a mussel shell. Chad watched the shadows dancing on the wall until the light burnt itself out. Apart from hearing the breathing of his companion and a strange moaning sound from outside, he felt very much alone. He would have sought out his brothers, but he did not dare. He could have wept, but would not allow himself. When sleep came, it was fitful and demon-visited. The moaning outside disturbed him, but he was not allowed to speak to his companion. In the dark it sounded as though demons or sea monsters were wanting to speak to him, and he was afraid. The sea itself roared like a great monster as Chad tossed and turned. He recited a prayer he had learned to protect himself from evil. Already he felt he was being called to spiritual warfare. God is my helper. God is my guide. God is at my side. God is my protector. God is my shield. God is my strength. I need not fear, for God is here. The next day he was rather embarrassed to hear that the demons of the night were seals, singing on the sandbanks at low tide. The song of the seals would be a sound he would forever associate with Lindisfarne, and a sound he learnt to love. More when I have a chance to record it.